Hello. Welcome. Great. Thank you guys all so much for coming. It's great to have such a lovely crowd here as we kind of kick off an interesting discussion this evening around design-driven companies and what makes organizations with designers at the helm interesting, to say the least, and hopefully successful, to say best case scenario. Exciting anyway. I'm Jess Lesperance. I work at Huge, which is a digital design agency, and I work in the user experience group, so I am incredibly interested in how people tick and what they do and how they think. I also love this music, but would love for it to get cut. Rad. It's distracting me. Awesome, thank you. This is amazing. Okay, I also have a great panel here tonight who I'm going to let introduce themselves. Why don't you start us off?
Hi, my name is Alfred. I am currently the Chief Design Officer for a new startup in San Francisco called Sia Labs, and we are working on Aero Labs.
Hi, my name is Matthew. I am the CEO of a startup which is kind of just around the corner named Mosey, and our goal is to bring the world better day trips.
Hi, I'm Mark. I work at Dropbox as a product designer, and for the last probably year and a half, I've been mainly focused on building out the Dropbox for Business product.
Hi everybody, my name is Enrique Allen. I'm the co-director of Designer Fund. We invest between $100K and $1 million in design co-founding companies, and we also produce a design education program called Bridge, where we partner with great companies like Dropbox, Pinterest, and Airbnb.
Great. So I hope you guys are as excited as I am to kind of dig in and hear a little bit about, or hear a little bit from our panelists. I think one of the things we've been kind of chatting about amongst ourselves is, what is a design-driven company and what does that even mean? And is it something that we can kind of pinpoint, or do we hate the term?
I mean, I can speak for myself. I think for us, sort of the idea of a design-driven company is really more about how design is all-encompassing at the company. I think it's kind of a no-brainer, in my opinion, these days to really make a product with great design. We try and sort of everything at Dropbox has design attached to it. So from you walk in the halls, there's posters, the kitchen, everybody that works in the kitchen, everybody that works in the office. Some of the best designers that I've worked with in my life have been engineers at Dropbox. So I think this idea of sort of a design-driven company is sort of like taking design out of this sort of specialized little shelf and just giving it to the entire company to sort of own that.
Probably, it was well said. Probably the only thing I'd add to that, or the way that I think about it as well, is that I think design-driven companies make a point of putting design into the boardroom, into the metrics, into the values. So everything that normally drives the culture and the behavior of an organization gets permeated by design as a principle. That's typically how.
So we talked a little bit about kind of the physical space, but I think it's interesting that design itself is essentially kind of creative problem solving. So I'm wondering if you guys kind of could talk a little bit about how that approach to business can help kind of companies thrive.
I want to just backtrack to say I tend not to actually use the term design-driven because in many sometimes throughout the business, sometimes you're making decisions that are more business driven, sometimes you're making decisions that are more technically driven, sometimes you're making decisions that are ultimately better for the user experience. I agree with Mark that design encompasses everything, but I'm just a little bit concerned around sort of alienating other people within the company by using the terms like design driven, where really everyone is making design decisions. So I just wanted to add that sort of caution. How can we again use design to be more collaborative and not sort of pit designers versus engineers versus business people? And I think Ed Catmull, one of the founders of Pixar, has I think a really cool quote or along the lines of like, there needs to be a healthy tension between creatives, business people, engineers, and if any one of those groups wins, we all lose. So I think that's something really interesting, is sort of the interdependent nature of the different disciplines. And I think that relates to sort of your follow-up questions around like, how can you actually use design in your process? But
I also want to add to that as well, because I think it's important for us to, as designers, to set a ground level of what are we actually talking about. I look at the term design-driven as a way to recognize that design, finally, is recognized as a value is connected to profit, connected to the success of the company. That's the only way design-driven as a term would make sense, because if you think of it as design, the word design-driven and the word design-driven as a profession, it doesn't make sense. You wouldn't say, try to plug in another profession. You wouldn't say, oh, my company is accounting-driven. It doesn't make sense. Architecture-driven. No, it doesn't make sense. When you say a company is design-driven, is that the company as an organization see value of design, meaning looking at the entire problem through the human lens as a value, and it drives the decision. But yeah, that's my point of view. But going back to your question about how designers can thrive in this kind of company, I think it's a lot to do with how you can demonstrate the rigor in helping your stakeholders envision a better future, a better alternative to what you're already doing, a better way of doing things that you have been doing for the past 20 years, and be able to convince them to execute the plan.
The question was, how can being design-driven make businesses thrive? But I almost think that your question around how can designers do that is more interesting, because I think it kind of flips it a little bit to put the impetus on us to kind of bring change to the places where we are. And I'm also kind of curious if you guys have experience or examples where you've really affected the process or the business or even, kind of the working model of the places where you've worked.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a lot of success in really very simply, I think it wasn't broken to begin with, but there's small things that can happen to make everybody aware of design and how important design is to the company. The environment is a big piece of it. Also just collaboration between everybody, so bringing everybody in on the design process from the beginning stage to the middle stage to the end stage is often, it gets people excited about design and they sort of take ownership over that. Hopefully, I've been at places where we've sort of had to push the issue a little bit more and kind of force it.
How do you do that?
So I've found that by actually setting up, this is like really tactical, but by setting up, sort of like critique sessions or like, obviously you don't call them that, but they're sort of like collaboration sessions where you get a bunch of people in a room and it's more of a social kind of thing. It's less, it's sort of less like hardcore, like, oh, let's design, and it's more like, let's hang out and talk about design. And it's not all designers, it's a bunch of different people from sort of cross-functional teams. And I think that it sort of opens people's eyes in the company to, number one, how important design is, and number two, like, they are designers. They can have a say in this stuff, and they should. I mean, it's critical that they have a say in this stuff. So.
Okay, next question. I'm curious, kind of as part of, and I think this sort of dovetails a little bit about what partners within your practice become most useful to you. Like, being designers and representing design is really essential, but like, who can we partner with outside of our own discipline to really kind of push us and evolve our thinking?
Yeah, I can mention just something from designers that I've seen with or without like technical partners. So we've been looking a lot at, designer co-founding companies that just maybe say have 2 designers versus maybe a designer and engineer, or 2 designers and an engineer. And it's been really interesting to see how much faster these companies work when they actually have a true technical partner on the team. So more and more we've been encouraging, pretty obvious, but for designers to really pair up and have that technical partner, just because just the sheer amount of time that it takes for just a couple designers who aren't super technical to ship something just takes so long. And it's not even necessarily working or at production quality. So I think finding a technical co-founder, technical partner, someone within your company that you can really pair with to do rapid prototypes, to make something actually work rather than just look like and kind of feel like, I think has been tremendous for us in evaluating companies, but also what we've seen within companies like Dropbox, Airbnb, and I think more and more there's also a role of sort of prototypers within companies, and I think that's a pretty interesting role, someone who's a kind of a hybrid between an engineer and a designer that can help quickly, get things on Android, get things on iOS, get things on the web, across multiple platforms, and express that across the different stakeholders within a company. So I think the role of kind of a rapid prototyper would be another great partner I would love to have in-house as a designer as well.
I absolutely agree. Having somebody who can quickly prototype something for you, it's super important. Because I used to work a lot on the digital side. Now I work more on the physical side. Things that look great on the screen, as soon as you even just make it in clay and put it in your hand, you have a completely different understanding of, in context, what that thing means. I also think, as a designer, to be effective, if you can pair up with a researcher or somebody who is just really curious about talking to people, it's useful because they are the people who can call bullshit, right? A lot of designers, is user-centered, but they user-centered working out of a loft all day. But really have somebody to push you out and talk to people and really understand what you're designing or who you're designing for, really just speaks volume.
Yeah, I think actually Enrique touched on something that was really interesting. So at Mozy, we started our business as a thesis project out of grad school, and we all went to California College of the Arts MBA program in design strategy, and really interesting, even more so now, a couple years later, as the program evolves, they're more and more of a diverse set of individuals, so when they're actually pulling together those project teams, it's quite diverse. But one of the things that was critical for us on our team in terms of bringing Mozy to reality was that pairing up with an engineer, and we actually, Eric, one of my business partners, actually found a friend of a friend who was an engineer who was really intrigued by our concept. And it was really having the engineer that actually brought us from what a friend of mine calls a deck and a dream to an actual business. So I think the power of that is definitely there. And then the other thing that comes to mind on this subject is I think there was a time when this conversation was really geared around cross-functional collaboration. I feel, and maybe you guys have seen this, maybe you disagree, but I feel like that as time goes on just becomes less and less of an issue because concepts like a prototyper are on the table. We're having these broader discussions about media crossing over into product and product into media and marketing and pretty soon the CEO of your business has an Instagram account and considers himself or herself a photographer and a writer and a designer. And that's not bad, and that's not even wrong. That's the way that the worlds are crossing into each other, and the way that we're starting to actually open up a conversation for design that is about everyone considering the power of a message and a product. So I think that's actually an opportunity for us more than anything moving forward.
Maybe one other role to pair up with, depending on like the stage and size of company you're at, is sort of similar lines of the researcher is someone on the data side. So whether it's a data scientist or someone with analytics, someone can like quickly pull reports, quickly give you access, or train you to get data yourself, because that empowers you. So the more that you can be data informed, we just had a workshop on just this basic process of coming up with a design insight. I think designers are really good at coming up with an insight, but then how do you turn that design insight into a hypothesis and then come up with, like, let's say 4 cells and various variations that you can go out and quickly test. And I think those are the steps that traditionally aren't really taught in school, and they're often difficult to do in the context of a company that's like moving really fast. So I think if we can somehow be more data informed and get used to speaking languages of engineers and more business people, because I mean data will help you win, or help you persuade people to go with your design decisions or with the team's design decision.
How much testing are you guys engaging in as one of the inputs in terms of your design process?
Tons. I mean, we've made it sort of a goal to be much more data-driven to some of our decisions. I would say a lot of our decisions. And we're doing more and more these days. We're doing A/B tests that some of them are sort of very extreme changes from the existing product, and some of them are very small optimizations that we can sort of like tweak and learn from. I think it's interesting because like a data scientist or even a researcher, like this data that comes in, having that ability to sort of parse that data properly and come up with like the next direction from these findings is invaluable. And in the last, it's definitely a priority for us right now.
We practically test nonstop. When we have a design cycle, which we actually about to pick up again, we will test every week. We set up our process such that at the end of the week, we already have people lined up. Even if we don't have people lined up, we have the survey set up, ready to go. Because in our space, it's so new. If you just build off an assumption, you are actually putting a risk downstream in your entire product development cycle.
Great. Yeah, I've found that to be one of the key places where it seems like as designers we can also kind of create change by bringing in sort of the voice of the customer in a way that I think design didn't always get to kind of channel or share out to the rest of the organization, which has for me been super powerful as a way to say, like, I think this is a good idea. So do all these other people who used it and found it successful.
I think data is often looked at as this kind of like the opposite of creativity and sort of this like enemy to creativity, but when it really comes down to it, some of these like wild experiments are kind of fucking crazy, like weird and stuff that you can experiment a lot with data, and you can get some really sort of creative ideas in there, and sometimes they'll win. So it's there's not a separation between data and creativity.
I don't know to belabor this point. Is this interesting to you guys too? I want to make sure you guys are like aware. Is this like relevant? How many designers are in the room right now? Oh, okay, awesome. And then engineers? Cool. Yes. Business people, entrepreneurs. Oh, so awesome. Okay, so we have a pretty diverse group. One other point I was going to say is just like in terms of testing with users. Is how do you create a ritual within the company? So whether that's like feedback Fridays and every Friday someone's coming in, or you're setting a deadline. Like I know one thing that pushes our engineers, like, hey, we have a session, a demo scheduled like 2 weeks from now with this amazing partner or client. Like we got to be able to ship this. So I think making it into a ritual and not something that like, oh, I got to go do this other thing or this extra work, but like turning it into something that's institutionalized within the culture of the company. So for me, even coming to this event, this panel, I'm just like, I would love to talk to you guys afterwards, hear your feedback, and listen. So it's like a research opportunity for me as well. So just kind of having that mindset all the time.
So I think a lot of us are entrepreneurs, designers. Like, why do you guys think there aren't more designer founders out there right now?
Wow. I think it's tough. I think culturally, entrepreneurs have typically been, well, I think what the dialogue, I don't even think this is true, but I think the dialogue is the place for the entrepreneur, is the place of the business person. I think if you actually look at history, that's not actually altogether accurate, but I just think that that maybe is what we believe to be true. And then I also think the possibility is there, I can maybe only speak from personal experience, is that if I think that the challenge of entrepreneurship is someone else's challenge, so it possibly would lean on another skill set or another function, at a time thinking to myself, well, I'm not a business person, so how successful will I actually be at building a business? I think those are kind of some of the voices, but I think what we've seen in this process, by obviously going through grad school, but also just by starting a product like this, is it's led with passion and a belief for something new and disruptive to happen in the space. And with that, then the art of finding the right partners is just the next step forward. And also I think within a business environment, and I think this has shifted a lot more recently, but within a business environment, often there is a pretty solid silo for designers. So access for designers into the space of what do other aspects of the business look like, or what conversations are we as designers being invited into, get a little bit trickier. And so I think sometimes that leads you to believe, at least, that entrepreneurship might not be as accessible as possibly others. But that's top of my head.
Yeah, I know I work with a lot of the partners that we work with at Huge, and often it's not the designers that are essentially driving a lot of the business change or the budgets or kind of the sessions or any of it. So I'm also kind of curious if you could tell us a little bit more about what it's like, and maybe you as well, kind of to be a designer founder and to drive that kind of discussion. And I mean, on one hand, maybe it doesn't matter at all and there's no difference, and it kind of, or on the other hand, maybe it is sort of a unique position to be in and something that you really kind of champion in your organization.
Maybe I can start. Looking back for the past 6 months, being the first time being a co-founder on the founding team of a startup, it's been great. Anything that I would want to do it differently is to do it sooner. Because if anything, as a designer, what drives me is that I want to envision a different future. I want to see something done differently. Something doesn't make sense. I want to nudge it to a certain direction. And startup is the best place to do it because you have no history, you have no past, you have nobody tell you, well, this is not how we do things, this is not us. You have nothing to reference on. But at the same time, you need to be comfortable even more than being just a typical designer, if there's such thing, is to have to be very comfortable with ambiguity. Be able to like roll the punches, be able to pivot, being able to roll with the conversation. And really try to define the conversation, not only just to follow it, not to keep up with it, but to jump ahead and define it. And that's, to me, has been tremendously exciting.
Yeah, just the first one earlier about the why don't we see perhaps more designer co-founders or designers part of the founding team of companies. We think a lot about this, and one observation is simply like lack of infrastructure. So if you look at the number of design schools that actually have, let's say, entrepreneurship classes or programs, or have technical classes, you know, it's pretty small compared to engineering schools. If you look at the amount of funding and investments, even in just locally here within the Bay Area into engineering school, it's like, you know, design schools are just dwarfed by the amount of pure funding. So I think historically, and then the second observation would be historically within Silicon Valley, we've had multiple generations of successful sort of engineering-led initiatives, starting with the semiconductors and why the name Silicon Valley is even Silicon Valley. So we've just had, just multiple generations and much more infrastructure, I think, for engineers to have resources. And then lastly, I would say, like, there just hasn't been that many at-bats. Like, Mosey's taking a swing right now, but they're just, if you look back since even just 2004, we've looked at all the designer-led co-founded companies, there's not that many. Like, we're talking like a few dozen, a couple dozen. Compare that to the thousands or hundreds of primarily engineering co-founded companies. There's just simply way more. So another thing is just we just haven't had that many at-bats. And then lastly, I would just say in terms of like public awareness or exposure, if you go to the street outside and talk to someone maybe outside of San Francisco and just say like, who Mark Zuckerberg is, people like know who that is. If you say like, who's like, Joe Gebbia or something like that, they're probably like, what was that? So I think just even public awareness in the general public is a lot less. There's just not as exposure and visibility. So those are some of the things that I've noticed. And then I just want to double down on what it's like to be a designer founder. I think that dealing with that ambiguity and risk, actually a lot of designers I've found are actually kind of risk averse. And actually to be both a designer and a founder means you need to be also a great designer and a great entrepreneur. So it means you need to potentially do two things really well. And so one of the huge things is just being able to deal with that risk, especially early on. And I think a lot of people just can't stomach that, not just designers, but just in general can't stomach, what it takes to, work on your, kitchen table for a year, put all your savings down, or like run your account negative or whatever it might be. So I think a lot of people just aren't willing to take that risk. And this is at the very early stage. Not all startups are like that, to be clear, but particularly as a founder where everything, at the end of the day, the buck stops with you and your team, so.
Yeah, I think everything out on the table, run your savings down to zero, all that. Yeah, that's right now. That's amazing. I think one of the interesting things on that note, and I thought that was really awesome, is I think also the dialogue among design-led organizations and the investment community is also tricky. I think there are a lot of really amazing people out there who want to put good money behind good ideas, but there's also a natural bias. So the amount of times we've sat across the table from someone who we know would be perfect for our idea, perfect for what we're doing, the space that they're in, their passion, their professed passion. And the first thing that they'll say is like, don't you guys need like a couple of engineers, a couple of Stanford engineers? I mean, isn't that what you need right now? And the fact of the matter is, if we come up light, that's certainly something that we need to deal with, and we have. But I think there's also just a sense that they're far more used to seeing people, a team of 3 engineers, and everyone sitting around the table is like, yeah, we'll get to design later, but we got the 3 engineers. So to flip that, and no one's bad, but to flip that conversation around and say, we have an amazing product, we have an amazing vision, we do need to build the technical side, but this is a team that can really execute on so many other fronts. Now let's step into the next phase, I think is interesting and different, and it's a new conversation.
Yeah, I mean, the Designer Fund is, that's it. That's what these guys are doing right now, so. Any designers with great ideas, talk to this guy.
Starting small, but
yeah, maybe you could talk a little bit about what you look for when you're kind of looking at investing in companies, or kind of what you're looking for from that meeting or pitch or product.
Well, I think, you hit a lot upon it, but we think of one is their missionary team. So a lot of people think of like visionary teams. I'm actually interested in people that are like, is this your life's work? Is this something that's really going to sustain you? When we've gone and researched some of the most successful companies, including Dropbox or even Pinterest and others currently right now, these guys were working on these projects as side projects. They're working on it, through thick and thin, in some cases for multiple years before they're actually venture backed. So one is just, is it really a mission that is really going to sustain you? Because I think that's the only thing that keeps you up at night and keeps you waking up in the morning, is that mission at the end of the day. Also, we look for a balanced team, and then the other one that I think has been difficult for me to stomach lately is the market, the global market. Is it really like So really timing, like I think we like to think that product can just like win and it's amazing, but like a lot of times it's like market timing and there's forces like outside of your control. So really, is there multiple market trends headed in that company's direction? Like why now? And so that's been a difficult thing for me to stomach. It's just like, damn it. Like I use this analogy of like, you could have the most like perfectly designed surfboard. It's like handmade, like koa wood or something. And like you go out to the ocean and there's no waves. So like you're just stuck there. You have a shitty surfboard, go out there, it's like styrofoam, but there's a huge wave, you're gonna get taken out and you're gonna ride that thing. So it's kind of like, just trying to just grapple with that recently. It's difficult to swallow. And then, I won't go into all of them, but you know, obviously from a product perspective, can it really be like 10 times better than what's out there? There's so much incremental innovation, but can it really be category defining? Is there some fundamental advantage that you have, or some secret or some insight that you're seeing that not everyone else is seeing? So I think that's also a very difficult one. And one thing that we're thinking about a lot of is it a space that traditionally hasn't seen a lot of design innovation? So for instance, like Brett Victor came on and talked at our space and he was like, hey, how many of you guys know like an oil engineer software looks like? I'm like, oil engineer? Like, what are you talking about? Like, and I'm like, whoa, he's probably making, that team is probably making millions, if not billions of dollars worth of decisions, probably with some really crappy software. And so no designer has really spent a lot of time thinking about that issue. Not to say I'm encouraging going to the oil industry at all, but just as an example. So those are a few things we look for.
I'm going to butcher this, but there was recently a Medium article that got circulated around working on shiny design projects. I probably butchered it and you probably don't even recognize it, but I think, okay, so I think it's an interesting concept of like what kinds of projects to tackle and how you choose them, and what you were just saying about oil made me think of that. And I'm wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about kind of how you choose what to bite off and where you put your energy in terms of prioritization and projects.
Yeah, the oil engineers software, sort of, when you look at this is sort of previous thing, but when you look at everything around you, just look at how many things are shitty user experiences. Like, it's kind of everywhere. So there's sort of like sexy kind of design projects that are getting a lot of hype, but when it comes down to it, there's a lot of work to be done for all this. And then on the shiny design thing, so at Dropbox, for the last year and a half, I've been working on a project that basically, if we've done our job, then you won't notice any difference in the product itself. And this was, I was doing straight design work on this project, and it's the idea of having 2 Dropbox accounts for a business account. And so it's truly sort of like eliminating interface and making it feel familiar and the same. There's kind of a lot of, so people always ask us why Dropbox has so many designers when, our product is sort of, doesn't have a lot of shiny stuff on it. And the reason is just that. I mean, it takes a long time to sort of like dig into these problems really deeply and eliminate interface and just sort of make that magic happen. So, think of walking into your house with like wearable stuff and your lights turn on and your TV comes on. Having that kind of experience, I think, is generally good design, where you don't know you're being designed to. You're just sort of experiencing that design. So I think that there's a lot of projects out there that are sort of not shiny balls that are beautiful to look at, but they're extremely creative and deep.
The way, it's very personal. I like to leverage my OCD personality. There are things that I walk by every day, for example, and it's just at the corner of my eye, this is not right, but everybody just walk by it. They just ignore it. But I would just spend like half a second and do it enough times, I would start to pick up these little friction points in life where somebody has to do something about this. And those are the kind of things that, to Enrique's point, turns into a little mission. And those that I like to focus my energy on and prioritize them.
I think the two things that stick out to me are, which have already been talked about, which are frustration points. I think that's the most interesting doorway into innovation. So if there's something in your life that irritates you, and potentially irritates you over and over, I think that's fascinating. I think the other place, and it gets to the oil engineer, is low interest categories. I think that that's really fascinating, and I think I've always personally been really drawn to that. I worked for a company called Method that makes soap, and boy, talk about a lame space to be in. I mean, who wakes up in the morning and is like, I am going to reinvent hand soap? Probably very few of us, but some really smart and really visionary people did that at Method, and it was a joy to go to work every day and work on soap, for God's sake. And so that really taught me a big lesson personally about the allure of shiny, and also the kind of the seduction of what appears to be shiny. Instead, focus on things that are irritating and things that no one else are paying attention to.
Great. I think now I'd love to open it up to questions and give a little time for you guys to ask things that are burning on your minds. Yes?
I thought that the last topic that you guys just spoke about was a really interesting one, which is things that people aren't always talking about, things that people aren't talking about as shiny objects. And when you talk about Method, I was really intrigued and wondering if you could talk more about that and some of the things you learned there that you're taking to what you're doing today.
I don't know. I think the power of the experience of being at Method, and I've worked in a number of other places, it's certainly the way we think about what we do at Mozy is...
what does Mozy do?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't want to shamelessly plug, but look, I just got the opportunity to. So as I said before, Mozy is mosey.com. You can find us obviously there and in the App Store. The way we think about Mozy is there's a large white space in between Yelp and Lonely Planet. So the way that you experience what's in your life and the way that you plan or think about what a great experience of either travel or what we call day trip to look like, it is a tool that allows you to discover, take part in, share, and it basically intelligently pulls in all of these inputs in your life and gives you a really great answer, skips all of that research that you would normally do when you want to discover your own neighborhood or when you're going somewhere else. So that's what we do. Please check us out. But back to your question, I think the most exciting thing for me is the subject of disruption. And I've always had a really hard time, actually my last job before Mozy was a good example of this. I always had a really hard time signing up for jobs that were kind of about polishing something that was already there. And the question of, do you work in a culture that has attached itself to the ever-present dialogue, even a pop cultural dialogue of disruption. And I think that that's a really fascinating, I think if that's built into a culture, how do we disrupt? How do we continue to tell this story differently? And a lot of times that as a subject, the way that it actually plays out is totally invisible. It's really phenomenal. But if it's an internal point of view in the culture that ultimately disruption is what you come to work every day to do, you come up with some really bizarre shit. It's really awesome. So I think Method, that was one of the big takeaways there. Obviously a great culture that has built design as a principle into absolutely everything they do, and that culture is more engineers, chemical engineers, than design by a long shot.
That's the only soap that I buy.
That's the only soap you buy?
Every time I buy one of those products, I'm like, huh, that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a really good example of that is when I first started there, they said, and I wish I had thought this up, but they're like, most products that you see in the grocery store have they've designed the package of the product to be a billboard in a grocery store. And if you really think about that, you're like, whoa. And they're like, we're not doing that. We're actually making a product that looks good in your home. So, I mean, even that little shift right there, I was like, wow, that's amazing. So, little things like that.
You want to just yell it out?
Yeah, sure. It's a two-part question. What was the name of the Pixar employee who said that healthy tension between different departments?
Ed Catmull.
Sorry?
Ed Catmull.
Ed Catmull.
Ed, yeah, Catmull. C-A-T-M-U-L-L.
So, I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, he has an awesome book. This is where it's from.
Okay. Yeah, kind of just like at companies where that balance is, or that kind of system is broken, how do you go about, I guess, trying to foster that environment and then creating safeguards so that the process doesn't become broken?
Yeah, I'm trying to think how to best say it. Is this for like personal, like your personal situation right now, if I'm asked?
I mean, I'm just kind of curious because it does seem like, depending on company culture, that it's not always the case that it's necessarily a level playing field where everyone has a say in the product being built.
Totally. I mean, for us, like a designer fund, like we want to work with like less companies, really have high touch interactions with. So like every company that we work with, like we go through it like a screen. Like, do they have a great mission? Do they have a great team? Do they have a culture? Is it a place where designers can grow? Do they have an existing design team, etc.? And so, if I get approached by a startup or a potential company and like you have to like fight to like prove the value of design, I'm just like, why would I waste my time like trying to like do that? So part of me is just like, I'm like, fuck that. Like, there's so many other companies that are out there that I'm like, why do I have to battle this? Not only do I have to do my job, but I also have to like prove to you that like my job is valuable or that design should have a seat at the table, etc. So that's my initial like knee-jerk reaction. But I think if you are committed to the mission or it's a really great cause or something, you know, for instance, we came across a company that's doing some awesome stuff in the environmental space and like sensors and like it's very tech driven, right? So some companies are maybe design isn't as much of a focus. Like design, you don't always need design, shiny design to succeed. There's going to be many companies that succeed without sort of design teams and without shiny design within the company. So I'm not like naive to think that design is always needed to be as successful, at least financially speaking. So to answer a short question, one is reconsider whether you should be working there if you have to sell design. Two is if you are really committed to selling design there, then I think reading books together with the CEO or the founders, coming to these talks or bringing them to get exposed, whatever the case studies or examples of other successful companies, that really works well with executives. Like, oh wow, this really successful company did this. This really successful company has this type of designers and this type of team, like, and they're doing really well. So whatever you can show like analogous or proxies for sort of great design, that's super helpful. And then I think if there's advisors or other people that are at that same level of the executive management, if you can somehow get them to talk to each other, that's another way is like you have sort of like a design advisory board or people sort of outside of the company that can help inject that for a bit. And I think that's quite honestly, I think a big role for design agencies and consultancies as well is to really model that design behavior and come in with an expert perspective and process and model that for the company, and then the CEO or the founder sees the value of that and they're like, oh wow, we should also, you know, invest in this more and bring more of this in-house.
And I'm going to give you my tricks right now. But basically, one way that I do that, it's just like mock it up and just do it if it is about kind of the finished product, and I don't wait for permission. And it's one of the luxuries of being in an agency as well, as you kind of get to be an outsider coming in. But I've seen it work over and over and over again, even within our own internal kind of time and priorities, is just do it. And if you think it's great and they can see it and you bring a skill that most of them don't have, which is kind of bringing things to life and making it real, that sometimes can also move mountains. I've seen people just sort of, and maybe not, you know, your core person, but the rest of the community will start to align around that as well.
I'll just add 2 points to it. It's kind of going off what Enrique said. We evaluate whether you want to be in that culture, because I believe that kind of tension, if once reached to a certain point it becomes conflict, it actually lies on the role of the leader. It lies on the role of the leader to communicate, this is the vision, this is why you're all here. You shouldn't be pointing at each other, you should be pointing at that vision and march towards it. And create a safe space for you to go out and do something different. And that's what designers are supposed to do, is to inspire change. And you need to be in that right environment in order for you to be effective. But second point I want to make is a reality that I learned as I was a junior designer, is that we are all a bunch of people. In the sense that designers like to change, like we always want to have something different, something weird, something a little bit out of the ordinary. Majority of the people in this world, they don't want change. And as a business, if you look at how business works, business extract profits by reducing risk. And every change that you introduce, you're actually injecting change into the system. And in order to be effective, you need to understand other people who don't share the same point of view as a designer, what makes them tick? Like what do they see as success? Like, is it about how do they align with that goal of the leader, and be aware of it and know when you are okay. This thing that I'm proposing, I'm gonna butt myself out of the process of how business has been done, and be prepared to provide proof either through research, either through prototyping, either through using case studies, analogies to support yourself. Because as you progress in your career, if you reach to the point that you have a seat at the table and you're making decisions that will change the course of a company, saying that I want this change because I'm a designer, because it's cool, it's not going to cut it.
No, actually, the question was more about. It was like more about how do you like invigorate an environment where everyone can critique each other's work without like kind of being hurt by it, like kind of like everyone being able to have a say in the product that's being produced, not so much.
Is this like a group of designers, or is this the entire company?
Yeah, just kind of like I guess trying to create an environment where every single department has a say, every single person is a stakeholder, and ultimately drives the product being produced.
Yeah, I mean, this is really tactical, and I kind of got at it before, but in my experience, I've been there before, and bringing everybody together in a casual, kind of semi-light environment that is not like, we're going to talk to you about design, and it's sort of a little bit more light, and even we set up sort of like little stations. We had a bunch of beer, people walked around, we talked about design to everybody. It just sort of opens it up a little bit more. I don't know if that helps, but.
Yeah, I'll give you another example from one of our bridge partners, Asana. They have different, so one thing about startups which I found fascinating is a lot of people actually don't know how decisions actually get made at their own company. Like, how does actually that product decision actually, like, how did it get greenlit? What's the process for actually making decisions? And a lot of times it's very opaque, very unclear. Maybe it's like CEO has the last call or whatever. So I think one thing that I think was interesting at Asana is they'll, for instance, have like a week where they'll get everybody's feedback. So whether you're on the customer support, whether you're on sales, whether you're on engineering, you're gathering, you're like, hey, this is our week to gather, to be generative. Right? Then this next week, this is where we need to start refining this, and this is where maybe a smaller team will break off, take into consideration everybody's feedback, acknowledge like, hey, I'm going to do this, or I'm not going to do this, and here's why. But that way it feels like everyone had a chance to have a voice and to contribute in some way. So I think one thing is just making sure everybody even knows where they're at in the process, and that they have at least a chance to, to give and receive feedback at these clear points. Because I think oftentimes in startups, like, people don't even get that chance. And then the other example I think of is like Wufoo, Kevin Hale's company, was acquired by SurveyMonkey. They had a sort of a customer support driven company. I thought that was really fascinating that each of even their engineers, their designers, everyone did customer support and had to feel the pain, and also gave them motivation to fix the problems and come up with solutions. So I think if everyone's also on the same page around what the pain points are and what the problems really are, you build up really a very human-centered sort of culture from the beginning. So that was also pretty helpful. And then another thing, this is actually another Asana tip for critiques specifically, is around, for instance, instead of saying like, you show me a design, and I'm like, that's confusing. And then you're like, no, it's not. And I'm like, no, I'm like, dude, that's confusing. Versus I say like, hey, to me, I think this specific flow is confusing. That's one data point. And you can say, okay, great, I acknowledge that, I'm gonna consider that and look at other data points, but just grounding the feedback. So there's tons of feedback and critique, like little tactical tips like this. We can go on and on about that, but that's just like a real subtle one that I found useful as well.
Maybe one last thing on that, and it kind of butts in with all the rest of this, which is most of the time the challenge in a culture is just making sure that everyone gets heard. But really actually the point that gets missed often is when they're heard. So a lot of times the kind of fail-safe, or like the cover your ass moment, is when you want to get everyone's point of view at the end. That's actually quite irresponsible in the grand scheme of things. It's typically far better to have input, let people be heard, but sometimes the appropriate time for people to be heard is at the very beginning. That we need their input, we need to put their point of view into the brief, or whatever that looks like. And by and large, that satiates that for most people. So I think by the time you get to the very end, you actually are probably talking about a very, very small group of people who should actually be giving input.
I think that's so smart too, because if you think about it, you're leveraging everybody's like best ideas right from the beginning, and if any awesome ideas come out, you can immediately kind of give that task to that person. And as participants, it's like your chance to pitch, like, I want to change this, I want to do this. I think at the agency we're often kind of tasked with a finite amount of time or a finite amount of kind of scope that we can work on a certain part of a product or something, but I think that would be a kick-ass way to kind of evolve the product.
Yeah. So you're doing design something really beautiful, but in the end it's actually just a container for sugar water. Do you guys worry about the ethics of something being beautiful design and the product that goes with it, or you just being invisible design? And ethics that go on with that?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mean to talk about the place I've been, but I worked for a place called Cliff Bar. I was on the agency side, and then I went to the brand side, and I worked for a place called Cliff Bar, which had an incredible ethic and a pretty strong moral center, sometimes too much. Just kidding, Cliff Bar. And then I worked for Method, which was very similar. And then after that, I went to work for The Gap. It was really fascinating how The Gap also does some really interesting things, but you're talking about a far bigger, far more complex notion of what is ethical. It's kind of almost like looking at the industrial food system in the United States. Like, there are so many different facets to that it's really tricky to come up with some sort of one moral truth. So I think that's probably the power of a conversation like this, is entrepreneurship, or at very least taking a part in something someone else started but that you actually believe in, I think is pretty core to what gives us the authority and the strength as designers to do things that we believe in. And sometimes that means stepping away from the sugar water, you know. That is a truth that you end up with at some point along the way. Not that we all haven't sold sugar water at one time or another, but eventually you get to the place where what you want to accomplish as an individual will just eventually trump that.
Yep.
There's a great professor at Stanford, Ron Howard, teaches decision analysis. So there's a really good book on ethics, and he just like really pulls it down to like some super basics, just like don't like lie in order to deceive people, don't hurt them, you know, like don't steal from them. It's like, okay, and then there's like, you know, there's positive ethics and negative ethics, and we can go into a whole like philosophy around that, but I think just ask yourself if you're doing any of those things, and if you are, then like you're probably like breaking that boundary. So I think if you just have some very simple, you know, heuristic like that the team can have. I think in entrepreneurship we get challenged with this because we're trying to do something new and envision the future state of things, and not that means like pushing the fringe of like what's legal and the gray area and like what can you really do, etc. And so, but again, that's for me. It's personally that's been more around like the business operation side and the opportunity. It hasn't been so much around the actual user that we're focusing on, because we primarily just serve designers, so we're just trying to like, how can we make designers happy? I think one other way to think about it too is you can persuade people to do good things, to do like healthy behaviors, and you can persuade people to do like potentially bad or like harmful or addictive behaviors. So like another way is just like, yeah, think about from the perspective of persuasion, and do you want them to do good behaviors or potentially unhealthy behaviors, and how do you define healthy and unhealthy? I mean, you can reference like the NIH or like something like that if you really want to get specific. Does that help?
I think it's also a bit of a gray area. I mean, you know, I think certainly myself, I've sold products that I didn't necessarily believe in, and some might say that's unethical. But you know, I'm not designing AK-47s either, so it's like I think that there is, you know, as a designer founders, I think certainly getting into something that you believe in is probably really important. But you know, when you're designing the Gatorade label, you know, you gotta get paid too. So.
Actually, I have a very similar question to that, or building off of that. To Mark, you were talking earlier about transparent design and that being an important principle of spending a lot of time kind of building something that the user doesn't even see. And I kind of wanted to ask if there's any concern or need to balance that with wanting the user to see some aspects of, you know, the complexity that we were just talking about, the persuasiveness of the product that we were just talking about. That of course you need transparent design to, you know, make the product compelling, but you're also removing some of that thought process behind, say, you know, with a cloud service, you know, where that stuff is stored, and what about my privacy, or, you know, with a wearables product, you know, what reasons why am I following all this data, and what incentives is this producing in me, and how do you balance that sort of need for transparency and making a compelling product with the need to maintain information for your consumer?
Yeah, that's, I mean, you nailed it, basically. It is like a real balancing act between having this kind of magical experience where, you know, we're picking the right defaults for people, we're sort of setting things up, we're trying to create this invisible experience where people can get to all of their stuff. At the same time, we need to message very strongly to individuals that their, you know, their work data and their personal data should never cross over. Even more so in the business product, we need to be really explicit to companies that their business data is very safe. So I think it sort of comes down to priorities and looking at what the most important knowledge for the people or for the business is, and trying to convey that. Also, it's how you convey that information. I think that you can convey it in a straightforward, honest, simple manner, or you can sort of just dump all this stuff in there that's just confusing, and there's extra things in there. So there's a lot of, like, I mean, messaging and tone actually does become somewhat important in that sort of invisible experience. Does that answer that sort of?
Another great example, Pinterest, I think, if you look at their terms of service, it's actually one of the best designs. Like, here's all the legalese stuff, and then here's what it actually means in like plain English. It's like very few companies I've seen do that. Again, back to your point around transparency, I think so that's a good balance where it's like I'm giving you the full technical specs and details, but I'm also giving you like the human, you know, natural language.
And maybe I'll also add to that is, I think the word balance is the key word here. I think, but the way I see the two sides of balance is, one, what is the value of my service? Do you see as much as the value of the service is apparent to you as to what you're about to give up? As your data, maybe it's your identity, maybe it's your preference, maybe it's history. So that's on one side. The other side is about whether I, as a service provider or a product designer, make it clear for you such that you, whenever you have a decision to make, you know what you're giving up. That's one thing. Two is, once I get whatever that I get from you, do you know how I handle it? So that's the second thing. And the third thing is when things go wrong, and things often do, what am I willing to step up and to fix the problem and be upfront about it instead of trying to sweep it under the carpet. I think that lies on the other side of the balance. That as long as the two things kind of like on kilter, people are okay. But if they start to see movements, people automatically have these knee-jerk reactions, and designers start to get into hot water.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Yep.
I was going to say there was one.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to lean in. So I want to get back to this question about the designer as the founder, or maybe all of the founders. And as designers, we kind of resist the idea of roadmaps and having PMs who need action items after the end of every meeting. And I'd like to hear some perspective about how you deal with what seems like contradictory hats, that you must have something to show, especially if you have a VC and they need to show for what you're doing, but you also want to engage in lean type processes. You want that swirly chance to innovate something that's not just what seemed possible in a 2-week period.
You should.
Yeah.
Take that.
I can try.
Have fun.
I would like to think anybody who is on the other side of the table, either whether it's a VC, whether it's a PM, who is worth his salt, know that the roadmap is based on what you know today. And if you are in a emerging industry like mine, and a wearable, whatever I put in front of you, you just need to understand as a placeholder. It's what I know today about the industry, and therefore I project where I'm going to go. And you trust me as a designer, entrepreneur, founder, that I'm going to find the best course as I navigate through these changes. And I need to keep you up to date. I need to keep you rationalize why I'm doing a certain action. I actually don't think being put into the spot to give you a status report, help you understand why I made certain decision is a bad thing. I think is as a profession, we actually need to demonstrate that rigor in order to have a place and be taken seriously. If you just walk into the meeting room and say, you know what, guys, like last week, this is going to be something else, and you have no way of backing up, and you do it repeatedly, people will start to go, okay, what is the designer cooking up? Like, what are they thinking? You know what I mean?
And I think that's brilliant. I think the other side of that coin, or at least pulling from my own experiences, is that the road of entrepreneurship is a road of humility. And if you learn one thing, you learn first all of your shortcomings. And so I think for everything that I'm personally willing to fight for in terms of the kinds of, I don't know if it'd be the kinds of schedules or the kind of work method or so on and so forth, I know that the people who are around me who have differing points of view and differing work methods are actually the people who are making me sharper. And so I constantly kind of personally lean on those individuals. It's not that we're always going to agree, but I know that that's adding a different dimension that's just making me stronger and making me more focused. And at very least, if I'm not agreeing with their point of view, I'm having to actually put together a much stronger rationale, which I think is important. So.
Maybe there's a Paul Graham also wrote a essay around a maker's and manager schedule. So I think, especially if you have to wear both hats, really making sure your calendar and your schedule reflects that. So making sure that you have creative chunks of time, like really try hard. It's so hard, but to have like 3-hour uninterrupted blocks, like before lunch and after lunch, and not Swiss cheese my days up with just like meetings after meetings or emails and whatnot. So I think a lot of it has to do just personally on us as creatives, managing our creative energy, and when we really have that creative fuel, and when the day it makes most sense to, you know, kind of debate and justify our design decisions. So I think that's one challenge that we can take a responsibility for on our own.
Awesome. I just want to add one thing, that I think a good idea goes a really long way. And if you can explain it, I've kind of shared ideas in so many different formats, whether it's like a really incredible motion video that we spent weeks making look beautiful and shiny, or whether it's like an on-the-fly collaborative idea that we sketch out on whiteboard and mess up, but like believe in. So I think if you have the spark and believe in it, that's the cue to you to go for it and to follow through with it. And the people around you will see it and help you and embrace kind of other people's structure, I think, because it will also free you up to do more of the creative work as well. At least that's my approach. I'm kind of grateful for all of the PMs out there in the room, actually. I love you. Thank you. So I also wanted to just thank our panel. I think this has been really fascinating, and I appreciate your thoughts on kind of how to push work forward and be better designers and also make the world a better place. So thank you.